My children, Marcus and Clara, didn't come to say goodbye. They came to plan my funeral while I lay helpless in a hospital bed. Behind a thin door, they greedily divided my inheritance, certain I couldn't hear them. But they miscalculated when my doctor walked in and loudly spoke the words that turned their greed into ice-cold horror. "She's going to live." The first thing I registered was the smell, a brutally sharp, clean scent of antiseptic that waged a losing war against the deeper, sweeter odor of sickness and decay. It had soaked into everything. The thin, starchy blanket that barely covered me, the unforgiving pillowcase, and the very air that my struggling lungs tried to process. The second thing was the sound, a high-pitched, steady beeping that echoed the frantic pulse in my ears. It was a metronome counting out the final seconds of my life, or so it felt. I was Eleanor Vance, 68 years old, adrift in the gray, murky ocean between a merciful oblivion and the painful shores of consciousness. My body was a dead weight, an anchor of flesh and bone I could no longer command. Every breath was a monumental effort, a shallow, ragged gasp that offered little relief. Pneumonia, the doctor had murmured, a vicious strain that had ambushed me in my own home and dragged me into this sterile, white-walled prison. Through the thick fog that enveloped my mind, other sounds began to penetrate. Voices. They were hushed, conspiratorial, seeping from the hallway just beyond the flimsy wooden door of my room. At first, they were just an indistinct murmur, the drone of voices in a dream. But as a fragile sliver of awareness pierced my stupor, I began to recognize their cadence, their tone. It was Marcus, my son, and his wife, Brenda. For a fleeting, foolish moment, a wave of warmth, a pathetic surge of relief washed over my cold body. They had come. They were here for me. That simple thought was a balm. But then the words began to take shape, sharpening from a dull murmur into distinct stabbing points of sound, and the warmth in my stomach curdled into a cold, heavy knot of dread. "The housing market is at an absolute peak right now," Marcus was saying, his voice a low, urgent hum that I recognized. It was his business voice, the one he used when he thought he was being strategic and clever. "We'd have to list it immediately to get the best price. Any delay would be a significant financial mistake. My house." He was talking about my house, not Mom's house, but it, an asset. The home where Robert and I had carefully painted the nursery walls yellow. The home where I taught Marcus to read and Clara to ride her bike. The home where every scratch on the wooden floor told a story. It was now just a line item on their financial agenda. A business transaction. Then Brenda's voice, sharper and higher pitched, a sound that always reminded me of cracking ice, sliced through his words. "And what about her jewelry?" "That sapphire ring from her mother is a classic. Mom would have wanted it to stay in the family, of course." I knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the sapphire itself, exactly which family she meant. I could practically feel the cold weight of my mother's ring on Brenda's perfectly manicured, grasping finger. The humiliation was no longer an abstract feeling. It was a physical sensation, a hot, searing flush that spread across my chest, more painful and potent than the fever that was already consuming me. This wasn't the sound of sorrowful children making difficult arrangements. This was an inventory count. They were vultures circling my still warm body, impatiently waiting for my last breath so they could descend and pick my life clean of anything valuable. A desperate, primal urge to move, to shout, to claw at the door and show them the monster they were, surged within me. I wanted to scream, "I hear you," but my body was a traitor. It would not obey. My limbs were lead, my vocal cords paralyzed. I was a prisoner in my own skin, a silent audience to the methodical dismantling of my existence, piece by greedy piece. The incessant beeping of the heart monitor seemed to grow louder, mocking me. A steady electronic rhythm for a heart that was shattering into 1,000 pieces. Just as a wave of despair threatened to pull me under for good, I heard a new set of footsteps approaching, heavier, more deliberate. A different voice, calm and authoritative, cut through their predatory whispers. "Mr. and Mrs. Vance?" It was Dr. Henderson. "I have an update on your mother." A sudden silence fell over the hallway, a stillness thick with their morbid expectation. I found myself holding my breath, my own fate being discussed like a stock market report. "The new course of antibiotics is working remarkably well," the doctor announced, his voice clear and strong. "Her fever has broken and her oxygen levels are stabilizing. She's not out of the woods yet, but she's a fighter. She's going to live." The silence that followed this proclamation was profoundly different. It wasn't expectant. It was heavy, suffocating, the dead air that follows a massive, unforeseen explosion. It was the sound of a guaranteed windfall slipping through greedy fingers. A moment later, the door to my room swung open with a soft click. With a supreme act of will, I forced my heavy eyelids to flutter, to lift just enough to see them. Marcus and Brenda stood there, frozen in the doorway, their faces a perfect, shared portrait of utter shock. But it was not the shock of joy, not the stunned relief of a prayer answered. It was the raw, undisguised, animal terror of a well-laid plan gone terribly, terribly wrong. They weren't looking at a beloved mother who had miraculously pulled through. They were looking at a financial asset that had just stubbornly, infuriatingly refused to be liquidated. Memories have a strange power when you're lying in a hospital bed, suspended between life and death, with nothing but time and the steady, rhythmic beep of a machine for company. They rush back, not in a gentle stream, but in a torrent, flooding the sterile present with the vibrant colors of the past. My mind, untethered, drifted back 35 years to the summer of 1990. The world felt different then, cleaner somehow. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass from our new lawn and Robert's comforting, dusty smell of sawdust and wood varnish that clung to his work shirts. We just bought the house on Elm Street, a modest 2-story place with a big oak tree in the front yard. It cost us $45,000, a sum so enormous it felt like we were buying a small country. I was working as a bookkeeper for a small, family-owned accounting firm. And Robert was a master craftsman, a magician with wood at the furniture factory downtown. That house was so much more than wood and nails and glass. It was the physical embodiment of every exhausting extra shift he ever worked, every penny I meticulously saved by packing our lunches instead of buying them from the deli. It was the foundation of our entire world, the safe harbor where we planned to raise our family. When Marcus received his acceptance letter from the state college in 1998, the pride I felt was quickly followed by a cold wave of panic. The tuition was a mountain we had no idea how to climb. The first payment alone was $10,000. Robert and I sat at our small Formica-topped kitchen table, the very same one I still own, the bill lying between us like a threat. We had savings, of course, but they were for emergencies, for a leaky roof or a broken-down car, not for a sum like this. The silence in the kitchen was heavy with our shared worry. The next morning, I did something I never told Robert. I went to my jewelry box and took out the diamond engagement ring my mother had given me on her deathbed. It was a beautiful, simple piece from another era, the diamond not large but full of fire and light. It was my most treasured possession, my last physical link to her. I walked the 2 miles to the jeweler downtown because I couldn't bear the thought of spending money on a bus fare. I remember the weight of the ring in my palm, the cold, assessing look in the jeweler's eye, and the hollow, naked feeling on my left hand as I walked out with a check. I never told Marcus about the ring. When he asked how we'd managed it, I just smiled and said, "We figured it out." He graduated 4 years later with a business degree and a firm handshake, blissfully unaware that his future was built upon the ghost of a ring that had once graced his grandmother's hand. Clara was my dreamer, her heart filled with music. She didn't want business school. She wanted a piano and then a violin. Each instrument, each book of sheet music was another unbudgeted cost, another small mountain to climb. So, on weekends, while other mothers were at home with their families, I took a second job. I tied a stained white apron around my waist and worked as a waitress at the Oak Tree Cafe, a bustling local diner. I spent my Saturdays and Sundays on my feet, refilling coffee cups, memorizing orders, and cleaning up spilled milkshakes. I'd come home late, every muscle aching, my hair smelling of fried onions and stale coffee. But then I'd open the front door and hear the sound of Clara wrestling a new melody from her violin, and the exhaustion would melt away. It felt worth it. My children's futures were being built on my sore feet and my mother's bare hand. I gave them everything, held nothing back. Then, 10 years ago, my carefully constructed world fell apart. An ordinary Tuesday became the worst day of my life. There was an accident at the factory. A piece of heavy industrial machinery malfunctioned. Robert was gone in an instant. The grief that followed was not an emotion. It was a physical force, an invisible weight that settled on my chest, threatening to crush the very breath from my lungs. After the funeral, after the casseroles stopped arriving, a check came in the mail from the factory's insurance company. It was for $250,000. Blood money. My children gathered around me, their faces etched with what I, in my fog of grief, mistook for concern. "You need to spend this on yourself, Mom," Marcus had urged, his hand on my shoulder. "Go on a cruise. Remodel the house. You deserve it." Clara nodded in fervent agreement, her eyes misty. I see now, with the painful clarity of hindsight, that their advice was a subtle, insidious form of poison. They hoped I would spend it all, frivolously, like a simple grieving widow with no financial sense. They wanted the money gone so there would be nothing left for them to worry about inheriting, nothing to complicate their lives. But they didn't know their mother. They saw the quiet bookkeeper, the tired waitress, the grieving homemaker. They had never known that for 20 years, my boss at the accounting firm, Mr. Abernathy, didn't just have me balancing ledgers. He saw something in me. He had me secretly analyzing market trends and managing investment portfolios for his highest wealth clients. I was the quiet engine in the back room, the one who saw the patterns in the numbers that others missed. Robert knew. He used to laugh and call me his secret weapon. We'd always been planners, mapping out our future, preparing for every contingency. We had a plan, a detailed financial blueprint for what to do if one of us was left alone. A week after the insurance check cleared, I made a call to our old family friend, Arthur Davis. He'd been our lawyer for years, a sharp, kind man with eyes that saw everything. I sat across from him in his quiet, leather-bound office, the check clutched in my hand. "Arthur," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in my heart, "Robert and I had a plan. Following that long-ago drafted blueprint, we invested the entire sum. Not in flashy, risky stocks, but in a carefully constructed, deeply diversified portfolio of blue-chip companies, municipal bonds, and real estate investment trusts. It was a strategy designed for slow, steady, protected growth. I went on living on my modest widow's pension of $1,800 a month, mending my own clothes, using coupons at the grocery store, and turning down the thermostat in the winter. My children saw a poor old woman struggling to get by, a testament to a life of quiet hardship. They had no idea that in a silent, forgotten corner of the financial world, a fortune was steadily, patiently, and powerfully growing in my name. A chill began to creep into our family long before I ended up in that hospital bed, a slow, insidious frost that settled over years. It arrived with Brenda. When Marcus married her, everything shifted. It wasn't a sudden earthquake that shakes the foundations. It was a gradual cooling, the kind that leaves a permanent layer of ice on everything it touches. Brenda saw the world through a lens of price tags and social status, and my carefully preserved, love-worn home did not in any way impress her. I remember one of her first visits as my daughter-in-law with perfect clarity. She walked into my living room, her expensive heels sinking into my old shag carpet, and her eyes performed a swift, brutal appraisal of everything I owned. Her gaze lingered on the sofa where Robert and I had picked out together, the one where we read bedtime stories to the children until they fell asleep in our arms. "Eleanor, this sofa has certainly seen better days, hasn't it?" she remarked, her lips forming a smile that didn't reach her cold eyes. "Maybe it's time for an upgrade." To her, it was just old, faded fabric. To me, it was a tapestry of my life's most precious moments. That comment was the first stone cast, and the ripples spread outward, slowly eroding the shores of our family. My presence in their new, shiny life, a life of country club memberships and leased luxury cars, became an inconvenience, an old piece of furniture they didn't know where to put. The weekly family dinners I used to host, filled with the boisterous laughter of my grandchildren and the smell of roast chicken, slowly faded into memory. At first, the excuses were plausible. Marcus had a late meeting. Brenda had a charity event she simply couldn't miss. Then the excuses became flimsier, the apologies less sincere. Soon, the invitations to their own home for holidays became less frequent, replaced by a promise to get together soon, a promise that was never kept. My birthdays, which had once been celebrated with my lopsided homemade cake and off-key singing around the kitchen table, devolved into a sad, predictable ritual. First, it became an obligatory, rushed phone call. Marcus would say his piece, "Happy birthday, Mom. Hope you have a great day." His voice distracted, the sound of keyboard clicks in the background. Then he would pass the phone to Brenda for a few polite, empty words that meant nothing. Soon, even the calls stopped. They were replaced by a generic 3-letter text message that would ping on my phone sometime in the late afternoon, "HBD Mom." 3 letters. That's what my 65th birthday was worth to them. Last year was the final, deepest cut. It was their 15th wedding anniversary, a milestone. I only found out they were having a party because Clara, my daughter, mentioned it in passing during one of her rare calls, assuming, of course, that I was invited. I wasn't. The silence where an invitation should have been was deafening. A few days later, my morbid curiosity got the better of me, and I looked at Brenda's social media page. There they were, the whole family, my son, my daughter, my grandchildren, all smiling, their faces glowing around a beautifully set table at a restaurant I could never afford. Everyone was there, beaming into the camera. There was no empty chair, no space left for me. It wasn't that they had forgotten me. It was that they had made a conscious decision not to include me. They had simply and efficiently edited me out of the family portrait. Looking at that picture on my small phone screen, I felt a profound and desolate loneliness that was almost a physical pain. The old kitchen table in my house, where we had shared thousands of meals, countless arguments, and endless laughter, now felt like a monument to a family that no longer existed. It stood in the quiet room, a silent wooden symbol of my complete and utter exclusion. Clara, in her own way, was just as distant. Her connection to me was a lifeline she only grabbed onto when she was drowning in her own self-made chaos. Her life was a constant series of small crises, and her calls were almost always a prelude to a long, whining complaint about her lack of money, her lazy husband, or her demanding children. She treated me not as a mother, but as a free therapist, a sounding board for her endless grievances. She would drain me of my emotional energy, clinging to me for hours on the phone, then disappear for weeks, sometimes months, only to resurface with a new list of problems that were always someone else's fault. The emotional connection had frayed until all that was left was a one-way street of need. They didn't want my time, my wisdom, or my company. They wanted a utility, an emergency fund, a free babysitter, a silent benefactor. They had carved me up into a series of useful functions, taking what they needed for the moment and discarding the rest. The woman who raised them, who sacrificed everything for them, had become invisible. The polite, cold distance soon gave way to something far more sinister and predatory. Once they had successfully established me as a peripheral figure in their lives, a satellite in a distant orbit, they began to view me not as a person, but as an untapped natural resource. The requests for money started subtly, wrapped in the disarming language of opportunity and desperation. The first major withdrawal came from Marcus. He called me one evening, his voice buzzing with a synthetic excitement that always set my teeth on edge. It was the voice of a salesman who didn't believe in his own product. He was on to a once-in-a-lifetime real estate deal, he claimed, a small commercial property that was supposedly a guaranteed gold mine. All he needed, he explained, was a short-term loan for the down payment. "It's $30,000, Mom," he said, the number rolling off his tongue with a casual ease that took my breath away. "I'll pay you back with generous interest within 6 months. I swear on my life. This is the deal, the one that will finally put me on the map." As he spoke, my mind flashed back to the cold countertop of the jeweler's shop, the feel of my mother's ring slipping off my finger for the last time. I remembered the greasy smell of fried onions from the diner clinging to my hair. But then I pictured Marcus as a boy, his face full of hope and ambition, and my resolve wavered. I was his mother, after all. What was I supposed to do? I went to the bank the next day and withdrew the money from my personal savings account, the small nest egg I lived on, making sure not to touch the principal investment portfolio Arthur managed. I handed him the cashier's check in my living room. He gave me a quick, tight hug that felt more like a business transaction than an embrace, and showered me with a flurry of empty promises. The 6 months came and went, then a year. The money, of course, was never mentioned again. When I once gently broached the subject, he looked at me with wounded eyes and said, "Mom, I can't believe you bring that up. I thought you were helping me." A year after Marcus's investment, it was Clara's turn. She didn't call. She arrived at my house unannounced, a masterclass in performative despair. Her face was puffy and stained with fresh mascara, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Her husband, she sobbed into my worn sofa cushions, had been laid off again. The roof was leaking, the car was making a funny noise, and the credit card companies were calling constantly. The story was a tapestry of misery, woven with threads of truth and exaggeration. She needed $15,000, she whispered, just to stay afloat until he finds something. She played on my sympathy with the skill of a concert violinist, her voice trembling at all the right moments. "I don't know what we'll do, Mom." "The kids." She let the sentence hang in the air, a piece of emotional bait I was meant to take. I wrote her a check from the same dwindling savings account. I knew, even as my pen scratched across the paper, that this was not a loan. It was a purchase. I was purchasing a temporary reprieve from her drama, buying her performance of gratitude for a few more months. The promises she made to pay me back dissolved as soon as the check cleared her bank account. The final, most audacious move came not as a plea, but as a meticulously planned ambush. It was orchestrated by Brenda. She and Marcus invited me over for a rare dinner at their home, a sterile, minimalist house that always made me feel uncomfortable. Throughout the meal, Brenda was unnervingly attentive, refilling my water glass before it was empty, complimenting my old dress, asking about my health with a feigned sincerity that was almost suffocating. It was all a preamble to the main event. After dessert, she cleared the coffee table and laid out a set of official-looking documents with a lawyer's letterhead. "Eleanor," she began, her voice as smooth and cold as marble. "We were talking with our financial advisor. He says that to avoid probate court and hefty inheritance taxes down the line, it's wisest to add Marcus's name to the deed of your house now. It's just a formality, really. A simple way to protect the family's assets." Marcus, on cue, chimed in, nodding eagerly like a puppet on a string. It just makes things simpler for everyone, Mom. It doesn't change anything for you now, of course. I looked at the papers, at the neatly typed line waiting for my signature. They weren't just asking for money anymore. They were asking for my home, the last bastion of my independence, the very symbol of my life with Robert. They wanted to own my life before I was even done living it. In that moment, a cold wave of clarity washed over me, so intense it felt like ice water in my veins. I looked at my son, the boy whose future I had bought with a piece of my past, and I saw a complete stranger. With a hand that trembled slightly, I pushed the papers back across the polished table. "I'm not feeling well," I said, my voice quiet but firm as steel. "I need some time to think about this." For the first time, the masks of loving concern dropped from their faces, replaced by a flash of raw, undisguised irritation. It was the ugly, impatient look of people who weren't used to being told no. The raw irritation I saw in their eyes that day festered into a deep, unspoken resentment. My refusal to sign the house over wasn't seen as a request for time. It was interpreted as an act of defiance, a selfish old woman clinging to what was rightfully theirs. A new, colder distance settled between us, a silence that was heavier and more profound than any before. Their calls, already infrequent, stopped altogether. Days turned into weeks, and the silence in my house grew louder, echoing with the ghosts of a family that used to be. It was in that profound, suffocating silence that my body, perhaps mirroring the state of my heart, finally gave out. It began insidiously, as a simple, dry cough and a persistent tightness in my chest. I dismissed it as a common cold, telling myself I just needed to rest. I drank tea with honey and lemon and pulled my old Afghan blanket tighter around my shoulders. But the illness was a stubborn intruder. Within days, it blossomed into something fierce and unforgiving. The cough became a deep, rattling beast that shook my entire frame. Breathing, the most basic act of living, became a conscious, painful chore, and then an all-consuming battle. The simple act of walking from my bedroom to the kitchen left me gasping for air, leaning against the wall, my vision swimming with black spots. I was too weak, too dizzy to even get to the phone to call for help. I lay on my old sofa, the one Brenda despised, drifting in and out of a feverish sleep, feeling my life force slowly seeping away. If my next-door neighbor, a kind, bustling woman named Mrs. Gable, hadn't noticed that my curtains were still drawn tightly shut at noon, a break in my unwavering daily routine, she might not have come over to check on me. She found me semi-conscious, my skin burning with fever. I might have died right there, alone in my fortress of memories, had it not been for her. The next thing I knew, I was in the stark white hospital room, a place devoid of memory or comfort, hooked up to machines that hissed and beeped and did the work my own body no longer could. I felt a loneliness that was bone deep, a terrifying isolation. The nurses were kind but perpetually busy, their faces a blur of professional sympathy as they came and went, checking my vitals, changing my IV drip. I spent the first day in a terrifying haze of medication and fear, each ragged breath of victory. My children didn't come. My phone, sitting on the bedside table like a black stone, remained dark and silent. They finally arrived on the afternoon of the second day. Marcus stood awkwardly at the foot of the bed, his hands shoved in his pockets, looking anywhere but at me. Brenda hovered by the door, clutching her expensive handbag like a shield, as if afraid to get too close, as if my illness might be contagious. They stayed for exactly 10 minutes. They offered a few hollow, pre-rehearsed words of encouragement. "You look better, Mom. Just focus on getting stronger," and then left, claiming they had an important meeting they couldn't possibly miss. It was later that evening, as I was drifting in that gray, watery state of semi-consciousness, that I overheard them in the hallway. It was the conversation that would become the defining moment of my life. the blast that demolished the final ruins of my love for them. At first, it was just the familiar, greedy talk about the house and my belongings, a sickening continuation of their previous plotting. But then the topic shifted, and Brenda's voice became cold and chillingly practical. "You know," she said, her voice low, "even if she pulls through this, she's going to need constant care. We can't provide that. I work, you work. It's impossible." Marcus mumbled something in indistinct agreement. "I was looking into a facility," Brenda continued, her voice dropping slightly, as if sharing a delightful secret. "It's called Golden Meadows. It's a very nice assisted living home, about an hour's drive from us. They have a spot available." An hour's drive. Just far enough to be a genuine inconvenience. Far enough to justify visits only once a month, then once every few months, and then, eventually, not at all. It was a plan for a slow, comfortable, guilt-free abandonment. This was no longer just about getting my money. This was a plan to erase me, to neatly and efficiently remove me from their lives, to put me away in a clean, quiet place where I would be fed and cared for by strangers, troubling them no more. That was the moment of blinding, excruciating clarity. The final, flimsy illusion of their love and filial duty shattered, leaving behind a horrifying, undeniable truth. To them, I was not their mother. I was a problem to be managed, a financial burden, and a logistical inconvenience that had overstayed its welcome. The goal was not to get me better. The goal was to get me out of the way. As I lay there, motionless, listening to them plot my final exile, I felt something profound shift deep inside me. The grief and the hurt, which had been a heavy, suffocating blanket, began to burn away, crystallizing into something harder, something colder, something powerful. It was rage. And with that pure, unadulterated rage came a fierce, unyielding will to live. The first week back in my own home was a strange, disorienting paradox. My body was still a fragile, alien thing, weak and unreliable from the ravages of the pneumonia. I moved slowly, my breath catching in my chest after only a few steps. But my mind, in stark contrast, was sharper and more focused than it had been in years. The betrayal I had endured had acted like a whetstone, honing my grief and disappointment to a razor's edge of pure, cold clarity. The moment I could sit upright at my kitchen table for more than an hour without the room spinning, I reached for the phone and made the most important call of my life. I dialed the familiar, memorized number of Arthur Davis. His voice, when he answered, was a balm of genuine concern and warmth. "Eleanor." I was so worried. I called the hospital, but they wouldn't give me any information. "I'm so glad to hear your voice." "I'm home now, Arthur," I said, and my own voice surprised me with its steadiness. The quaver of the frail, elderly woman was gone, replaced by something firmer. "And I need to see you. As soon as you can spare the time. It's urgent." He didn't hesitate. "I'll be there this evening." He arrived just as the sun was setting, his old, scuffed leather briefcase in hand. He sat across from me at the kitchen table where Robert and I had shared so many meals, his kind, intelligent eyes studying my pale face. I didn't waste time with small talk or pleasantries. I began to speak, and the story of the past few years poured out of me, not in a torrent of emotion, but in a calm, methodical recounting of the facts. I told him about the slow, painful alienation. I told him about the carefully calculated demands for money, the exact amounts and the broken promises. And then, my voice dropping but never wavering, I told him about the final, brutal conversation I overheard in the hospital hallway, the talk of selling my life off and shipping me away to Golden Meadows. As I spoke, his expression shifted from deep sympathy to a quiet, controlled anger. A muscle twitched in his jaw. When I finally finished, he was silent for a long moment, simply looking at me. Then I asked the question that had been burning in my mind, the question upon which my entire future now hinged. Arthur, the portfolio, the one we set up all those years ago after Robert died. I've never touched it. I need to know the exact number. I need to know what I'm working with. He nodded, then opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick, navy blue, bound document. He put on his reading glasses, his movements precise and deliberate, and flipped through several pages filled with columns of numbers. "Eleanor," he said, looking up at me over the rims of his glasses, "you were incredibly disciplined. You never once touched the principal, and you always followed the reinvestment strategy we laid out even when the market was volatile. Thanks to your patience, the market's overall performance, and the simple, beautiful power of compound interest, the initial $250,000 has grown substantially." He paused, taking off his glasses and looking me directly in the eye. "As of the close of the market yesterday, your total portfolio is valued at $2,700,000. The number hung in the quiet air of my humble kitchen, seeming to displace the very oxygen. $2.7 million. It felt abstract, unreal, like a number from someone else's life. But Arthur wasn't finished. He reached back into his briefcase. "And there's more," he said, his voice holding a new note of excitement. "Do you remember that small commercial property partnership Robert bought into years ago? It was a bit of a gamble at the time. He left his minority share to you in his will. It's been quietly generating a steady income, which, per your instructions, we've been rolling back into your main investment fund each quarter." He slid a second, slimmer folder across the table toward me. "The partnership owns a few commercial buildings in the downtown area. One of them is a mid-size 3-story office building on Maple Street." He let that sink in for a moment before delivering the final, poetic, devastating blow. "I did some checking after you called me this morning. I had a hunch. One of the long-term tenants on the 3rd floor of that building is a boutique real estate agency. It's called Prestige Properties. According to their corporate filings, it's where your son, Marcus, has been working as a senior agent for the last 5 years. I stared at him, the words refusing to compute at first. Marcus, my son. The son who thought his mother was a poor old woman living on a meager pension, had been paying rent, my rent, every single month through a series of corporate entities, completely and blissfully unaware. He was a tenant in his mother's secret empire. The irony was so perfect, so deliciously symmetrical, it felt like it was plucked from a work of great fiction. In that stunning moment, sitting at my old kitchen table, all the swirling emotions of the past weeks, the grief, the rage, the humiliation, receded, replaced by a single, powerful feeling: resolve. A plan began to form in my mind. It was not a plan born of hot, impulsive rage, but of a cold, clear, and profound sense of justice. It would be methodical, precise, and utterly beautifully legal. My children had wanted to liquidate my assets. I decided then and there that I would liquidate their expectations instead. A week later, every detail of my plan in place, I summoned my children for what I called an urgent family meeting. I didn't call them myself. I had Arthur send them a formal typed letter on his firm's expensive cream-colored letterhead, requesting their presence at his law office on Tuesday at 10 a.m. The official nature of the request, I knew, would both intrigue and intimidate them. It would make them feel important but also uneasy. They arrived together, Marcus and Clara, with Brenda, as expected, trailing behind like a shadow, her face a mask of suspicion. They walked into the polished mahogany boardroom with an air of nervous, arrogant confidence. They were clearly assuming that this was the day my resolve had finally broken, that the sick old woman had been scared into submission and was ready to finally sign over the house. They saw my physical frailty as I sat at the end of the long table and mistook it for a weakness of will. That was their second and final miscalculation. I was seated at the head of the table, a position of power with Arthur to my right, a silent, formidable ally. I felt a strange, profound calm settle over me, the calm of a general about to execute a flawless battle plan. "Thank you for coming," I said, my voice clear and steady, echoing slightly in the quiet wood-paneled room. Marcus leaned forward, arranging his face into a practiced, sympathetic smile that no longer fooled me. "Of course, Mom. We were worried when we got Arthur's letter. We're here for whatever you need. You know that." "I know exactly what you need," I replied, my gaze unwavering as I met his eyes. "So let's get right to it." With a silent nod from me, Arthur slid 3 pristine, navy blue folders across the polished surface of the table. One stopped in front of Marcus, one in front of Clara. Brenda, ever the opportunist, reached for Marcus's folder, but Arthur held up a hand, his voice gentle but firm as granite. "This is a private family matter, Mrs. Vance. If you'll please just observe." Brenda recoiled as if she'd been struck, her face tightening with a fury she could barely contain. She sat back, her arms crossed, a silent, fuming spectator. "Open the first folder," I instructed them. Inside, they found notarized copies of the personal checks I had written them over the years. Attached to each was a legally drafted ironclad loan agreement, which Arthur had meticulously prepared, documenting the $30,000 for Marcus and the $15,000 for Clara. The agreements had been backdated to the day the checks were cashed, with a standard legally defensible interest rate applied and compounded annually. "Those were never gifts," I stated calmly, my voice devoid of emotion. "They were loans. I have records of your verbal agreements to repay them. I expect repayment in full, with all accrued interest, within 90 days. Clara let out a small, strangled gasp, her face turning a chalky white. Marcus stared at the papers, his mouth slightly agape, speechless. "You can't be serious," he finally stammered, trying to produce a laugh that came out as a dry croak. "Oh, I am deadly serious," I said. "Now, Marcus, if you would be so kind as to open the second folder." Inside was a single, crisp document. It was an official notice from the commercial property management company that owned his office building. It informed its tenant, Prestige Properties, that upon the expiration of their current lease in exactly 30 days, their monthly rent would be increasing by 300% to match the current and long overdue market rate. Marcus's eyes scanned the page, his face a mask of confusion, then dawning, sickening horror as he looked at the signature on the bottom of the letterhead. It belonged to the holding corporation that I, through Arthur, controlled. He looked up from the paper, his eyes wide, and stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "And finally," I said, my voice dropping slightly, drawing them in for the final blow, "the third folder." They opened it together, their hands trembling slightly. It contained a single, freshly printed page. It was the executive summary of my last will and testament, revised, signed, and witnessed just 2 days prior. Their eyes darted desperately down the page, searching for their names, for the familiar, comforting words of inheritance. They would not find them. "Not my own children," I began, my voice strong, letting the words settle in the suffocating silence of the room. "They planned my funeral while my heart was still beating. They stood in a hospital hallway and calculated the market value of my home. They saw a frail old woman, a burden to be managed, and a bank account to be drained. They never bothered to look closer. They never knew who I really was." I leaned forward, my hands flat on the table, meeting their stunned, terrified gazes. "My entire estate, currently valued at over $2.7 million, which includes the house you were so eager to sell and the building where you work, Marcus, will be placed into a charitable trust upon my death. It will be called the Robert Vance Foundation, and its sole mission will be to provide financial literacy education for widows, to help women protect themselves from vultures like you, I paused, letting the full, crushing weight of my decision sink in. "Your names," I concluded, my voice as sharp and final as a judge's gavel, "are not mentioned." The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum broken only by a choked sob that escaped from Clara. Their inheritance, the wealthy future they had been so arrogantly, so callously planning, had just vanished into thin air. All that was left in the room was the heavy, suffocating weight of their own greed. 2 years have passed since that morning in Arthur's office. The silence from my children has been absolute and unwavering. I have not received a single phone call, a desperate letter, or even an angry text message. It is as if, upon being disinherited, I ceased to exist for them. Their absence, which once caused me a pain so profound I thought it would break me, is now a quiet, peaceful, and welcome space in my life. The old house on Elm Street, which for years had felt like a lonely repository of fading memories and ghosts, is now bustling with a new kind of energy and purpose. I sold it just as Marcus had so desperately wanted. But I didn't sell it to a stranger who would erase our history. I sold it for a nominal fee to the foundation that now bears my beloved husband's name. It serves as its official headquarters. The living room, where Brenda once sneered at my old worn sofa, is now a bright, welcoming classroom. Twice a week it fills with women, young widows reeling from sudden loss, older women who have been left with nothing after a lifetime of homemaking, and they learn about investing, budgeting, and protecting their assets from those who would prey on their vulnerability. The dining room, where my family stopped gathering, now hosts board meetings and planning sessions for our outreach programs. The house is more alive now than it has been in years. I did not retire to a quiet life of solitude, knitting in a rocking chair. I found a new purpose, one that feels more authentic and fulfilling than any I have ever known. I am the chairwoman of the board for the Robert Vance Foundation. I don't just sign checks from a distance. I am actively, passionately involved. 3 days a week, I sit at my old kitchen table, which I moved to my new, smaller, and brighter apartment downtown, and I personally mentor women who find themselves in the same terrifying position I was in after Robert died: vulnerable, confused, and overwhelmed. I teach them how to read a balance sheet, how to talk to financial advisors without being intimidated, and how to spot the predatory language of those who see their grief as a business opportunity. I share my story with them, my whole story, unvarnished and honest. And in their eyes, I see a reflection of my own past pain, but I also see a spark of their own future strength, and I help them fan it into a flame. I no longer look at the old family photographs that line my bookshelf with a sense of loss or bitterness. The smiling faces of my young, innocent children belong to a different time, to a different woman who believed that love and sacrifice would be enough. I have learned the hardest, most painful lesson a mother can learn: that the love you give is not a guarantee of the love you will get back. My legacy will not be 2 ungrateful, resentful children who inherited a fortune they did nothing to earn. My legacy will be the hundreds, perhaps thousands of women who will be empowered to stand on their own 2 feet, armed with the knowledge and confidence that I was forced to rediscover in myself in the darkest of times. Sometimes, in the evening, I sit by the large window in my new apartment and look out at the sparkling city lights. I occasionally think about Marcus, who I heard had to leave his prestigious job and is now likely struggling to make ends meet, and about Clara, who for the first time in her life has to live within the means she always complained about. I don't feel anger or satisfaction or even pity. I feel a quiet, profound sense of justice, of a balance restored. They made their choices, and they are living with the consequences, and I made mine. My message to the women I help is simple, and it's one I now live by every single day. Your value is not measured by what you have given away to others. It is measured by the wisdom you have kept for yourself. Before you invest everything in someone else's future, Make damn sure you have fully invested in your own.